Right. I'm seeing a lot of great comments in the chat, but I just wanted to kind of transition us to the discussion section of this evening. As it sounds like many of you are mentioning in the chat, some of the parts of this documentary and this history more broadly are pretty hard to watch and to reckon with. So I'm glad that we have this time together as a community to discuss it. So for those who missed the beginning, my name is Alana Seeger Van Dyke, and I'm one of the co-chairs of ABCT Sexual and Gender Minority SIG, and I'm honored to moderate this discussion between our esteemed panelists, Mr. Gregory Caruso, Dr. Charles Silverstein, and Dr. Jerry Davison. So we heard a little bit about folks at the end of the documentary, but just to reiterate, so Greg Caruso is a writer, director, and producer based in Los Angeles. After graduating from USC's Cinema School in 2014, he founded his own production company, Bristol Pictures. His previous work includes The Flock of Four and Making the American Man, both available on Apple TV and Amazon Prime. Conversion is his third full-length documentary. Excuse me, Dr. Charles Silverstein is a psychologist and activist, best known for his role in removing homosexuality from the DSM in the 70s. He's received numerous accolades for his work, including the American Psychological Foundation's Gold Medal Award for Life Achievement in the Practice of Psychology, and APA Division 44's Distinguished Professional Contribution Award. He's published 8 books on LGBT topics, including The Joy of Gay Sex, A Family Matter, A Parent's Guide to Homosexuality, and Gays, Lesbians, and Their Therapists. He founded the Journal of Homosexuality, which many of us have published in, as well as 2 LGBT affirming counseling centers in New York City, Identity House and the Institute for Human Identity. And then Dr. Jerry Davison is a professor of psychology at the University of Southern California. He began his career at Stony Brook, where he played a central role in creating Stony Brook's uniquely behaviorally oriented clinical psych PhD program. And he also directed the postdoctoral program in behavior therapy for many years there. He has published more than 150 publications and 3 textbooks, including Clinical Behavior Therapy, which was co-authored with Marv Goldfried, and the textbook Abnormal Psychology, which he co-authored with John Neal. He served as chair of the psychology department at USC twice, and is a fellow of APA, and the Academy of Cognitive Therapy, and he received the Clinical Science Visionary Award from SSCP in 2020. Here at ABCT, as we know from the film, he served as president in 1973 and 74, received the Outstanding Educator Award in 1995 and the Lifetime Achievement Award in 2003. So we have a wonderful crew to discuss this important history with us this evening. So just as everyone can feel free to add questions in the chat, and I'll try and get to them. But let's start off by speaking with Greg first. Just what drew you to this topic and inspired you to create this documentary in the first place? And how did you decide to focus on Charles and Jerry as the main subjects of the film?
Well, firstly, thanks for having me and Charles and Jerry. It's been a long time coming, so I'm happy to be here, and I'm very happy to see all the comments come in. But I think I came across the story 2018. There is a podcast called Radio Lab, and I had started off in documentary filmmaking, had made 2 documentaries after graduating in 2014, and then I was focusing on writing scripts. And I told myself I wasn't gonna make another documentary, but I was driving one night listening to the podcast and was incredibly inspired by the story. I think for me, it was the openness on both sides to come together and to make positive change, especially because of the divisive times we're still in. I thought it was a really important example of people listening to each other. And then again, going out there doing the work and making some really positive changes, in this case, in the gay community. So after I listened to it, I reached out to Jerry. I think we grabbed a bite the week after Christmas, which was a couple days after I listened to it. And then he put me in touch with Chuck, and we just got to filming. I was honestly surprised. it wasn't already a documentary. Um, and now we're here. So it's been, I guess, 3-4 years in the making.
Well, thank you so much for making a documentary that should have existed earlier. I
Yeah.
think it sounds like everyone has really enjoyed it and learned a lot from it. So Charles and Jerry, how did you get involved in this documentary? Obviously, we heard a little bit of that story, but what was it like for you to see your story told through the lens of this documentary?
I defer to my elder,
Jerry.
Chuck. Go ahead, Chuck.
I want to tell you one reaction I had this time watching the film. It was early, and I saw some of the people that I worked with in those days, and they're all dead. Some died of the usual diseases, but a lot of them died of AIDS. And while this film is about Jerry and me, the fact of the matter, as far as my contribution, it wasn't something that I did by myself. There were a number of us who worked together, sometimes constructively, sometimes destructively. And I saw some of those people in those pictures and felt very sad because I miss them. I miss the work we did together. I miss the accomplishments, and I miss their friendship.
So my reactions are, it obviously takes me back to the early days of the association, my early education and training in behavior therapy in the early and mid 60s, and how I'm struck by how much things have changed. And I know that in terms of the elephant in the room, I know that there's been some controversy within the association about this film, about behavior therapy's role in conversion therapies, so forth. And I'm understand it. I'm kind of dismayed by it. I'm saddened by it. I think one thing the film might provide is some historical context to things that are very important now. And I think that this is lacking a lot in our graduate education. And I'm one of the graduate educators, having been in this business since my PhD. And we're not, I don't think we're telling the story as much or requiring students to be familiar with the early days. And the behavior therapy, one of its earliest targets was what we call the sexual deviations. But even before that was alcoholism. In the 30s or 40s, one of the authors was someone named Kantorovich. And there are lots of stuff. I mean, to quote Chuck's wonderful line about it, I don't want to bore you with all the details, right? I could bore you to death with them. But I hope the film has that, plays that role for particularly the younger members to understand where we've come from, and that things were very, very different then. They were very different then. And there's no picnic now. And in fact, the clouds on the horizon, they're all too familiar with now. So the battle is far from one, as we said in the film, but there's a great deal of progress. And I'm happy and proud to say that this association has played a central role in it. That from being kind of the bête noire of trying to make these changes, after analytically oriented primarily, people try to make these changes, and then realizing that it's irrelevant. And I mean, to me, that's the simple truth. And I'm still amazed by how many people don't get it, that whether you can bring about a change is not relevant to whether you should. One can argue that if you try to bring about a change and it's impossible to do it, you're going to harm people, and that's true. Make people, iatrogenically worse, if you will. But the difference between can and ought is profoundly important. It's guided a lot of my teaching, my professional life. So those are my reactions generally to watching the film again.
I want to add something else. I support everything that Jerry just said, but people in the association don't realize how naive behaviorists were in those days. They operated from a simple stimulus response theory. They didn't yet have the O for organism. And when they used aversion therapy, they just assumed that shocking subjects, when they saw men having sex, that would automatically cure them. There was even an idiot, I'm not shy about my words, idiot in Tulane who used the prostitute. In those days, they had a theory called the pleasure centers in the brain. And what he did, he drilled 2 holes in the subject's head. Imagine this, the gall, and attached wires and threw him in another room with a naked prostitute with the idea that having sex with this prostitute would cure him, because while she was there, he would give little jolts of electricity in the head, and that would create pleasure, and that association would cure the gay man. The psychoanalysts were no more sophisticated. We talked a lot about Socarides. This man was so stupid about working with gay men. He used to brag to all of his students that he can spot a gay man on sight. And he didn't even know that his son was gay. And I'm not telling tales out of school, because the son later came out to him and became quite notable in the gay community. So it was a time when there was a lack of sophistication in understanding anything about the sexual behavior of gay men and women, and finding the best ways of dealing with them.
Thank you so much to you both for those really important points. And I'm seeing a lot of comments in the chat, kind of echoing Jerry's comments around kind of the lacking parts of our training models in these areas for clinical psychology trainees, and then also just kind of reflections on how different things were back then. So thank you both for those kind of reflections. There are many follow-up questions, but let me just, switch quickly to Greg. I'm curious, as someone who was not around, I'm assuming, back in the 70s, what were, as you were kind of putting this documentary together, what parts of this history were most surprising or striking to you?
Man, a lot of things. History really intrigues me, and it's part of the reason I wanted to make this project and shed some light on it. I think for me, some of the things that both Jerry and Chuck said about Freud, I hadn't known. I was a film major, interested in psychology, but not well versed by any means. And I didn't know how some of Freud's teachings and theories were destructive in this sense. a few more things, just researching a different kind of lanes and avenues it took me to. I would say finding out about Evelyn Hooker was fascinating for me. Reading some of the old texts, the Kinsey books, and then just some of the crazy theories that Chuck, he just alluded to one, but a few that are included in the film. Not being around then, not being around, at the turn of the century with Freud and everything, it's amazing to me to think that people could latch on to such crazy theories and believe them. But then again, it does give me an appreciation for being alive today in a sense, and society's growth and questioning things and being open to discussion. But it's a tough question for me to answer because the entire film for me was really going back in time. And I hope that wasn't too long of an answer, but it was a mixture of things.
No, that was perfect. Thank you so much, Greg. We have a number of questions in the chat basically around this topic of what can folks do now, right? So a lot of folks have been talking about Dr. Silverstein's and Jerry's bravery in speaking up against conversion therapies during a period when it was really a high risk to do so. So looking back, is there anything you would have done differently? And how would you advise folks today who want to take a similar stand but are concerned about the consequences?
I wouldn't have done anything differently. I would, if anything, I would have worked earlier. But no, I would. It was unfortunate because there was, some of the gay people, male and female, were so damaged because of the horrors they went through, whether it was psychoanalysis or reversion therapy. Some were sent to mental institutions. Then working in those days, our committees were composed of some people with a strong sense of social justice, but also a lot of people who were so damaged. And when we tried to cure people of behavior that is not abnormal, we hurt people very badly. And if I represent anything, and I think Jerry does too, is that has to stop. Don't cure anything that isn't sick.
One thing I'd add to what Chuck has said, we agree on almost everything. The issue of values and biases was alluded to at the end of the film, but this is where my interests were probably kindled mostly through the epiphany, if you will, thanks to Chuck, but it was part of my early training education at Stanford in behavior therapy. And I was lucky to get really good training in one of the few places one could at that time. And I was taught that values are so totally separate from what we do as psychologists. And I believed that. I was taught that by great people, and it was a big mistake. I think it's utterly wrong. And my intellectual and emotional journey via the issues regarding treatment of homosexuality, same-sex sexual orientation is part of my increasing belief that it's all about values. A lot of it, anyway, is about values, and we've been ignoring this. And APA, I think, is lip service. There should be discussions of ethics in your graduate programs, and so you read the APA Code of Ethics. If you're ever having insomnia, just open up the APA Code of Ethics, and I guarantee you'll be asleep in 90 seconds. That's my cure for insomnia. The core issues have to do with how we define the good life and how we define problems. These things change over time, and they're part of our training as clinicians, whether we like it or not. When I got into the field as a graduate student, I didn't know this. And this is sort of like an extra responsibility, but also a privilege in being a clinical psychologist or other mental health workers, psychiatrists, social work, what have you. This is part of our job, and whether you like it or not. And so if you want to be in this field, you really have to confront it. And for me, this is an overriding, that's an umbrella under which issues regarding same-sex orientation, trans, and other issues find themselves. But the more general issue, it's got to do what problems, what do we desensitize people to? I wrote about this, I talked about this in my presidential address back in 74 and the 76 paper. And I hope that folks, if you haven't read it, I hope you have a look at it. What we decide is a problem that needs to be desensitized to. I'll just tell one story. Many years ago, I was consulted by a professional woman who was anxious and wanted to be desensitized, and knew I was a desensitization expert, if you will. And what was her problem was the infidelities of her husband. And she got really nervous when her husband didn't show up and when she thought he was lying to her. And she wanted to be desensitized to this. And so this was before my epiphany with regard to homosexuality. I said to myself, well, self, is this a worthy project? And I very quickly concluded it was not. And so I told her in the first session, I said, well, I don't think that's a good idea, and I won't do this with you. And so I figured that might be the first and last session, but it was not. Turned out she was delighted to hear this from me, from a man no less. And we had, I don't forget how many sessions surrounding issues in her marriage. So I use that as just one personal, from my own clinical experience, example of how these issues are facing us all the time. And I think most of the time we don't properly confront them. And I think that's a mistake. And I recommend, among many things, there's a wonderful book I cite in my original paper by Seymour Halleck, 1971 book called The Politics of Therapy. I'll bet you there aren't more than 2 or 3 people, and I mean no offense, you're a lovely group, any group of people, of mental health experts, either have never heard of Seymour Halleck, have never read the book. I urge you, do yourself a favor, read the book. It's fairly short. It's called The Politics of Therapy. And it says a lot of the things that I think are relevant in our discussion regarding the conversion issues.
Thank you so much, Jerry and Charles, for those recommendations. I'm mindful that Marv has his hand raised. Marv, do you want to unmute and ask a question?
You have to
he's muted.
unmute Marv.
Yeah, hi Marv. He can't hear us.
Hey, Marv.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
That's the unmute button. Oh, these old people, they just don't get
Okay, I
anything.
got it.
Oh, we can hear you now.
Now, okay,
No.
great. What do you
Hi
mean?
Marv.
Hey, so this was great. I love the documentary, and what it does is it gives us a taste of what you two guys did, but it's only a taste. And I want to underscore, what you both did was something, you made something out of nothing. So Chuck, there were no protests. You didn't have to do this. You went from no protests to protests. And Jerry, nobody was speaking up in the straight world and the professional world about this. And you spoke up in a context of nothing. And I think it's very, very hard for people nowadays to appreciate it because of how far things have come in the acceptance of sexual minorities. So I just want to push that a little.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marv, for highlighting
Thank you.
that. Yeah. Many questions, so little time. Let's see. We have a couple of questions about kind of piggybacking off what we were talking about with regard to kind of taking action. So Steve had a question around, living in Florida where conversion therapy is allowed. Watching this makes me wonder if any pending cases will go to the Supreme Court. Wondering about what might be the very best arguments that can be made to counter conversion therapy practices, and if there are more things that our professional associations like ABCT can do. Any thoughts from anybody?
Well, there is no more aversion therapy.
Mhm.
That's gone. What there is today is religiously inspired attempts to change sexual orientation. Most states now have laws against trying to change the sexual orientation of someone, but that's only for youngsters 18 and younger. But there are no longer professionals that try to do this.
Not at least according to their ethical codes. So I know that many people in the audience have shared at least experiences with me of some professionals absolutely doing some of these things. So not necessarily specifically aversion therapy, but this conversion therapy idea, right, of changing
Well,
sexual
wait a
orientation.
minute. If someone out there is a licensed professional and is trying to change the sexual orientation of someone, they should be reported to the ethics committee of the state. That's a simple thing to do.
Right. Any thoughts, Jerry, as well, on this topic of how to tackle this at a political or legal level?
Well, I'll try to be responsive to your question. They kind of, speak up when you're in graduate school, when you're teaching. You see something you think is wrong. You need to do more than complain about it or cancel someone. This part of this culture, with all due respect, I simply don't get. Someone once said to me, "Aren't you concerned you're going to be canceled?" And my answer was, "How will I know if I'm canceled? And then so what?" So some people are concerned about this, but it's generational, I'm sure. But the thing is that we have opportunities in our graduate programs and our undergraduate teaching as well to encourage people to think about things and think really hard about things and to think very carefully about things and when you think something's wrong is you have to decide whether you're going to take a chance and speak out. Chuck described it very well. I remember our meal together in Port Jefferson. I recall Chuck being at the Elk Hotel on Main Street in Port Jefferson with some seafood, and he was cautioning me as a friend, and I decided it really didn't matter, and it really didn't, and it didn't then, doesn't now, but it, at some point in your career, you'll come upon issues or questions. You have to decide whether you're going to take a stand or not. But you have to try to do it in a way that I was going to say in a smart way. I don't mean I don't mean it quite that way. To do it in a strategically effective way. Think it through. How can you best make a difference? And that's what I tried to do back in 1974. I had the opportunity. The timing was very, very good. I've been thinking about these things somewhat even before Chuck, but I wasn't there yet for sure. Chuck really turned my head around, and I was president-elect of ABT. And I knew that one of the things that a president-elect has to do is give a presidential address as he's becoming president, past president. So I said, well, what am I going to give my address about? And I thought, wow, this will be really kind of interesting to give a presidential address about. So I had an opportunity, an obligation, really, but an opportunity to try to talk about something. You know, I had a forum, at least within the association, to speak out. I will say that, you know, this is, you know, ABT's grown some. I will say that I'm puzzled and disappointed that ABCT's voice, or ABT's voice at that time, was not heard. We were invisible in the mental health establishment. And I think we still are, largely relative to the impact that we have had on the field. The phrase, for example, evidence-based therapy, oh, that's very, very sexy sounding. Evidence-based, empirically validated. We were doing that. That's where we started from. That's been our very essence. Following on the coattails of Carl Rogers in terms of doing research in psychotherapy, but we were doing it from an experimental psychological foundation. And it's like we lack, I believe, still lack the recognition that I think the association merits and should have. And I'm hoping that that the apology, for example, I don't know whether there's been any reaction to it yet. I haven't seen anything in the press about the apology. If the APA, either one, were to do this, it would be on the front page of the New York Times. Where is it? Where has it been talked about? Maybe it has been. I've missed it. I hope someone will send me that information. I think the association has the brain power and the values and the know-how to have more societal impact than I believe it's had in the years of our existence.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. I mean, it sounds like kind of getting involved in social issues like this one could be one such platform to start making ABCT be seen more on a national stage. So I love that idea. We've talked across this last hour about kind of improving training and improving how we teach our clinical psych and other mental health trainees about the history of our field. So who do you think would be a good audience for this sort of a documentary? And are there additional kind of readings or ways that you think those among us who are involved in training could start to kind of include this topic in our training programs for anybody?
I didn't understand your question.
That's okay. It was long and convoluted. This is a great documentary. Folks want to teach their clinical psych trainees about the role of our field's role in conversion therapies. How do you think we should go about teaching them? By showing this documentary, for example? Are there other things?
No, teach it.
In lecture form?
There's no secret about the history of our field. There are papers, there are books. Teach it. If schools want to teach, they'll teach. The reason psychologists in this country don't have any knowledge about human sexual behavior is because the American Psychological Association doesn't require it. And all schools teach for the APA requirements. If you want to teach something, just go teach it. You don't need to plan it. Just do it.
Now, that one other thing with regard to history, I've talked about this a lot here at USC, and I don't know, perhaps Marvel will remember if we ever talked about it much at Stony Brook. But knowing the history, just the history of behavior therapy, let alone of psychology, is not taught very much. It's not required. The history requirement a la APA, the training programs, in my experience, find ways to finesse this requirement. They have ways to work around it. We do it. I'm sure I know other programs do it. We'll have a little bit here and we'll, such and such happened. Oh, by the way, things happen in our field earlier than 1980. It's another way to put it, and earlier than 1970. And we have to teach. We have to learn about this. I emailed my friend Alan Kasdan just last night or this morning, because Alan wrote a wonderful book called, I think it's called History of Behavior Modification. I think and published it in the late 70s. It's a wonderful book. I wrote him and asked him if he could recommend something in addition to that. And he suggested a chapter he wrote in a handbook. It was published in 1982 called History of Behavior Therapy, Behavior Modification. These are, agreeing with Chuck, teach it. I mean, you decide you're going to teach it or not, but will you get enough enrollment in your seminar for you be allowed to offer it for teaching credit? This is a very, kind of down to earth, kind of mundane, pedestrian consideration, but it's a reality in at least research oriented universities that award PhDs. You have to have enough enrollment. Most students aren't interested in it. They're not interested in it if they don't have to take it. They don't have to take it. They're not interested in it. And I think that's too bad. I think that's it's unfortunate. And I've contributed to this lack of interest. I take my share of mea culpa on this, but I've tried to, in various ways, to encourage this as best I can. This film, I think, getting back to the film, I think it can be one vehicle to help people get interested in the field. I must say, I don't know if I mentioned this to Greg when he interviewed Chuck and myself for the film. I was surprised by the getting into discussions of Freud with Greg, I didn't come prepared. I luckily was able to pull from long-term memory, and I hope that I didn't get my facts wrong. I didn't expect to be asked about this, but in looking at the film again now today, I'm struck by how happy I am, how grateful I am to you, Greg, that you made this part of the interview, and you kept it in the film itself as context. Again, it's context for conversion therapy generally, and with particular emphasis on behavior therapy. I'm sorry, I may have rambled a bit, but.
No, that was perfect. And it's actually a great segue, because I'm curious, Greg, obviously you're coming from outside of a mental health background, but I'm curious who you hope sees this documentary, because maybe we can help with that, get out the word.
Yeah. Well, let me say first, if anyone's interested in showing it in more forums or in classroom settings, please let me know. I would love for it to reach a ton of students across the country. I've talked about this with Jerry and Chuck before, and who would I love for it to reach? And I think it's ignorant people with an open heart, people who don't know that maybe what they've been taught or believe in is hurtful, and who, not to equate it to Jerry too much, but someone who is open enough to learn and then admit their wrongdoing. And I think there's a lot of people out there in this country. So any and in all ways we can share the documentary and play it and do Q&As. I know for me, I'm constantly learning, just sitting and listening to Jerry and Chuck talk about the history and their experiences.
Thank you so much. Yeah, folks with open hearts. I love that. I can think of many people in my own life for whom that would be applicable. Okay, so as we're approaching near the end, I'm wondering about folks' thoughts about what still needs to be done to make psychology and psychiatry and mental health more broadly a more equitable field. Are there other DSM diagnoses that need to be reconsidered, for example? What thoughts do you have in that realm?
Sorry, I might have missed that. Sorry. Can you
Sorry,
repeat that?
sorry, my cat was running through everywhere. So this is mostly for Jerry and Charles. What do you think needs to be done to make psychology, psychiatry, and other mental health fields more equitable? Are there other DSM diagnoses that need to be reconsidered, or other types of therapy that we need to reconsider?
Well, we could-
I don't know what you mean by equitable.
I guess, open to kind of human diversity and responsive to everybody's kind of different identities and perspectives. So thinking of other marginalized groups, for example, are there things that we need to do better?
Well, I think the question here is, what is psychology about? And I think that a discussion like that will take us far afield, especially because everything's become so political lately. I don't think in terms of whether a field is equitable. I think in terms of whether people are being served or harmed, which is different.
I know one thing is, there was a time when behavior therapists did not worship the DSM. And my friend Marv has written very well about these things. I lament the flight to randomized clinical trials as the be all and end all based on the DSM, waiting for the next edition of the DSM. Who cares? What happened to functional analysis? What happened to, the field is now discovering mechanisms of change. Whoa, big deal. This is not a new notion. This goes to the very beginnings of behavior therapy. In the late 50s, a man named Shapiro, in terms of laying out the foundations of behavior therapy. But somewhere along the line, driven in part, I think, by NIMH funding, and driven by the hegemony of the DSM, you couldn't get grants unless you package people in this way, and sort of, and also in process kind of medicalizing people's problems, de-emphasizing the social context. So I would love to see, at least in addition to assessment being oriented so much and research being organized so much around the DSM, to looking more at what the SORC, stimulus organism response consequential variables are in controlling behavior loosely defined. So that's sort of in part of this. So someone mentioned DSM. I have a conditioned aversive reaction to it, for which I'm not seeking treatment. I've decided I want to have that aversive reaction. I think it's adaptive and justifiable. Thanks for listening. If people can send me a bill for listening so well, because I feel better about having expressed it. I think the DSM, by and large, is not to our advantage. I don't think, I was going to say it's a curse. That would be, I would never think of saying something like that. So forget I even thought that. But it's not doing us any favors. It's really distorting our research, distorting our clinical work. This idea of manualized treatments applied to particular DSM disorders. I worry about this. I think this overlooks a lot of the idiographics, which is what functional analysis, at the end of the day, is all about. Anyhow, sorry, that sort of triggered. You should have given me a trigger warning, Ilana, before you said DSM.
Yeah, this is there's a related question I think is a good jump off from that, around kind of about some of the quotes from Chuck's original speech that Jerry then later reiterated in his speech at the 1974 convention. And someone was wondering if you both believe that the acknowledgement of environmental stigma and oppression will shift our conceptualizations of mental health problems and thinking regarding diagnoses. So do you think that this idea of thinking about environmental stigma and oppression will continue to change the mental health field and how we think about mental health problems?
stigma is never good. Period. There's nothing more to say.
Right. And kind of attributing natural reactions to stigma is maybe
I don't know what a natural reaction is, but I'm
Mhm.
saying stigma is bad for people. They do not do their best when they feel bad about themselves. Period.
absolutely.
Well, and I think generally the behavior, our field of all fields should be sensitive to the social context. We started out being perhaps overly situationally oriented, if you will. Sort of think broadly about when people talk about what's the stimulus for this response. Well, this stimulus is a complex concept. It's not just the red light or the white light, the noise and the rat and the Skinner box, or the box with a little white rat is. It's a complex situation, and what makes it good and what makes it bad. The history of our field with regard to same-sex attraction is a perfect example of this. It was assumed that and Chuck alluded to this, that you and my Playboy therapy naively assumed this as well as part of a treatment package that gets somebody positively feeling very positively oriented in a sexual way, and then flash him a picture you want him or her to get more turned on by. I mean, it's quite an extrapolation from the laboratory, but it's it's embarrassing. And it's not only do I regret having been involved, I'm embarrassed by it. It's part of the growth we do as a field. But I think getting back to a question Alana, I'll try to, is that we need to do more of it. We need to, look at the social context, study sociology, study history. I get kidded around by some of my colleagues that I'm always interested in graduate applicants who are not psychology majors. Psychology majors are very, very narrow in what they study. I'm interested in students who have broad liberal arts education. I've written stuff on this. I think I can send you boring articles on this. This should be part of the education of all people in all mental health endeavors. And then we can begin to have it as part of our, I don't know what metaphor to use, as I say, not part of our DNA, but it'd be a natural way of looking at things and considering the whole context. So the field of social work has been doing this far longer than clinical psychology has been doing. We have a great deal that we can learn from our colleagues in social work on this.
Thank you so much.
I'd like to hear more from the people participating about their comments or questions.
Yeah, we have a few minutes. If anyone wants to unmute and make a comment, feel free to do so.
Well, the
People seem
comments
to be very shy. Oh, guess not.
We have lots of comments in the chat. Oh, we have one brave soul. Sue, do you want to unmute and say something?
One brave soul. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? No,
Yes,
I'm
you
muted.
can.
Am I muted?
No, you're not muted.
Okay.
We can hear you.
So I'm not muted. So I really appreciate this, and I appreciate hearing the context. And I've got to give some context because I'm a counseling psychologist, but my first organization I went to was AABT, and I'm still a member of ABCT, but I don't go as much. And part of it was because I didn't think that the organization was as responsive to things that had to do like with LGBTQ, lots of discussions about the questions that you ask Elena, in terms of what else do we do, but I think we also need to do it specifically. And to give you a little bit more, when I left college, way back when, I went to graduate school in 1968, I went to sociology at Columbia University, and people asked, well, why didn't you go to psychology? And I said that I felt psychology was a dirty word, that all you had was psychoanalysis or behavior therapy who were doing more harm to people. And then when, I don't know how I heard it, but I actually was not a member of AABT because had not, and I felt so happy saying, oh, someone is criticizing this field. So years later, I joined at age 40 a counseling psych program. But so I just wanted to say that. And the other things I wanted to say was, Gregory, I think a really nice use of your film, and I work with doctoral counseling psych students and graduate counseling students, and I'm about to retire, but I also do something called difficult dialogues at Oklahoma State University. And Oklahoma is as bad as Florida, if not worse, than the issues we're talking about in terms of outlawing stuff for trans kids, in terms of not every issue you can, in terms of advocates. What do? We go to the legislators, we go to the licensing boards, we teach our students how to do that, but it seems not to be enough. I think this film could be used with undergraduates and others to look at this history as an issue of being able to distinguish between what Jerry said, and I'm afraid I don't want to get your words wrong, Jerry. You said could or should, going back to the values and the moral compass, and that's all I want to say. But I really like this film. I can see a lot of uses for it, Gregory, not just in the classroom. And so and I think there's other issues with that. And so, and you're right, when everyone who said this, the battle is continuing. I see people don't hear about Oklahoma a lot, but we're the most socially conservative state in the US. Our governor's worse, and somebody else agreed with me today, than the ones that are being advertised in Florida and Texas. It's pretty bad, but we do have people standing up and trying to do things in the many different ways they are as human beings. That's my only comment. So bravo for doing this, and bravo for doing the film, Greg. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. And I love the idea. I'll figure out a way to connect with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sue. I'm looking at the time. We have just a few final minutes. So before I close us out, I just wanted to check if Greg, Jerry, or Chuck have any final kind of words to close us out, or if you would like to share any projects that you're working on at the moment or anything like that. Any final words?
No.
Nope, you're good, Chuck. Great.
Yeah, I would just close it out by thanking everyone again. And to Sue's point, I really do like the idea of trying to organize screenings in states where this is still happening, even if it's just on a religious level. I think that would be incredibly impactful, and to actually go to those places and hold screenings and Q&As. So I put my email in the chat. If anyone has more ideas on that front, I would love to hear them.
Fantastic.
And thank you for moderating, Alana.
Of course, no worries.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, great. All right, well, let's close us out there. Thank you so much to Charles and Jerry, of course, for doing all your important work in moving our field away from conversion therapies. Thanks to Greg for creating this important documentary. And thank you to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and speak with us this evening. I also wanted to thank ABCT leadership for hosting the event and amplifying this important history this year by issuing the statement against conversion therapy and the other ongoing efforts they're engaging in to eliminate conversion practices in the mental health field. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say. So thank you all again, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.